going to be attempting the repair of my Hitachi 50-inch plasma television. It's about 5 years old, and I'll show you the symptoms. I'm now going to turn the TV's standby power on, which is a switch underneath here, also known as a vacation switch. You would leave this in the off position if you were going to be away for a while. It is now in standby. I will now use the remote and attempt to turn the TV on. The fan starts to come up as if it's going to power up, and you see that one band on the right hand side briefly show up, and then nothing else happens, but that blue power light flashes. And it's flashing 3 times, and what that is the TV is now in the protection mode, shutdown mode. Something is wrong, and the system is self-diagnosing itself and generating an error code, which is 3 flashes. So my next step is going to be to shut the power off, unplug the TV, remove the TV from its stand, and place it face down on the floor on a carpet, so that I can remove the back and expose the electronics. So my TV has the power swivel base, so I disconnect this little cord right here, which is the interface from the TV to the power swivel base, and then I've got to remove these 4 Allen head screws, and then I'll be able to lift the TV off of the stand so I can lay it perfectly flat. Okay, there are a lot of screws that have to be removed. All of these screws around the perimeter that have an arrow next to them have to be removed. They're all of the same type. And then these 4 large screws have to be removed. There's 2 on that side. These are also where the bracket would go to mount this on the wall. And then these screws here with these washer style heads have to be removed. But I'm going to start by just removing the ones that have arrows pointing to them. Almost all of the screws that had arrows pointing to them, and on my first attempt to remove the cover, it doesn't want to come off. So now it's clear to me that these 2 screws over here and those 2 over there that match them don't have arrows pointing to them, but they're going to have to come out. I did miss one right here, and it sure looks like these 2 are probably also going to have to come out, even though they don't have arrows pointing to them. I'm going to hold off on these screws here because they look like they might hold in this panel as a separate unit. Right, I've got all the screws out of the back here, and I'm getting ready to remove the panel, and now's a good time to talk about safety. I would recommend that if you do not have any experience working on electronics, that you do not attempt to repair your flat panel TV or any other electronic device that plugs in. TV sets and other electronics can actually store a charge even when they're unplugged from the wall in devices called capacitors that can pose a possible shock hazard. And the other thing about this repair, or the replacement of those capacitors, is going to involve desoldering and soldering the new ones in. If you do not have good soldering skills, again, I would not recommend attempting this repair. If you feel confident that you can get the board out in one piece, you might want to take it to a local repair shop and see if they'll do the actual solder in and solder out for you of the caps. Now, when I got out of the TV repair business about 15 years ago, the 27-inch CRT based TV, the cabinet was pretty empty. There was one main board, and that board was probably about the size of this power supply board in the middle here, and it basically had everything right down to the tuner, the high voltage transformer, everything all self-contained on one board. The large scale integration had progressed to such a point that they were able to fit the entire electronics needed to run the whole TV on one board. Now we come to a more modern plasma display here, and this thing's loaded with electronics, and it just goes to show you how sophisticated a system it must be in order for this thing to actually work. Now, I know that this board right here in the middle with some transformers on it and these heat sinks and everything. This is the power supply. I believe Hitachi calls this the PSU board. PS for power supply. The board over here, this board over here is known as the XSUS board, XSUS. So I'm going to call it XSUS board. And then I believe this board right here is the logic board, because I can actually see these flat chips right here. These are microprocessors. So this is the board that's responsible for all of the data, interpreting the different remote commands to turn on, turn off, monitoring the system. I mean, there's a lot going on in that board. Over here on this side, we have the YSUS board, YSUS, and the two SDR boards. That's S as in Sierra, D as in Delta, R as in Romeo. You have the SDRU for upper and SDRD for down. Up, top of the screen, D, down, bottom of the screen. These three boards are going to be the primary focus of my diagnosis, my diagnostic here. That and these two capacitors on the power supply. These are 3300 microfarad, 100 volt capacitors that are notorious for going, they notoriously go bad on this power supply and cause problems that can lead to the failure of the YSUS and or one or both SDR boards. Alright, now I talked about how I have the flashing LED, power LED, after I try and power it up, and it flashes 3 times, pauses, flashes 3 times, pauses, and how that's an error code. Now that actually tells me a little bit about what's going on with the TV set power supply also. That tells me that my standby power supply is working, because if my standby power supply wasn't working, then the TV wouldn't be able to respond to any commands from the remote. For instance, the attempt to turn it on. The other thing that tells me is that there's a good possibility that my logic board is okay. At the very least, it's telling me that the logic board is operating well enough to interpret commands from the remote control and attempt to turn the TV on. And then what's probably happening is when the main power supply tries to come up, it's monitoring and sensing unusual voltages and shutting down. Now, it could be a problem with the power supply itself, or it could be some sort of a short, for instance, in one of these boards that's actually putting too much of a load on the power supply, and the power supply is shutting down to protect itself. Now, I was able to find a chart online that told me that 3 blinks, that one of the possible causes of 3 blinks is from the LED is a bad YSUS board, and that the other probable cause is a bad either one or the other or both SDR boards. So that's going to be why my focus is there. And also, based on what I've read online, it appears like a lot of people have run into problems, again, because of these caps taking out components out here. One of the first things you can do is you can check for any obviously burnt or damaged components that look like they've been overheated on the piece on the power supply board, and then especially over here on the YSUS board and the SDU boards. SDR boards. These are buffer ICs. There are 8 on each one of the boards, and if you look very closely at the tops, if you see any little pinholes or cracks on the tops, that would indicate that that IC had shorted and so much current had flowed through that it actually ruptured the case. Now, I don't see that on any of mine, so that doesn't necessarily mean that the board or the ICs are good, but if you do see a burn mark on one of them, then you know you've got at least one bad buffer IC, and that board is going to need to be replaced. Unless you have the highly specialized desoldering and resoldering equipment, which would allow you to replace the actual individual ICs.